Yeah.
So it's starting up. Let's see. All right. Welcome on this lovely Wednesday. My name is Virgil Moorhead Jr. I'm the Behavioral Health Director here at Two Feathers. I'm also part of the Big Lagoon Rancheria, which is Yurok and Talawa. And this speaker series is part of Two Feathers Native American Family Services. For those of you that are tuning in for the first time, we are a family service nonprofit agency that serves Native American youth and their families in Humboldt County. Humboldt County is in Northern California, about 5.5 hours north of San Francisco. I have a awesome, great guest that I'm really excited to talk with. And I also have one of my great colleagues, Ellen Colgrove. So I'm going to have Ellen introduce herself, and then I'll introduce our guest for today, which is Mary Kathryn Nagle.
Hi, everyone. This is Ellen Colgrove. I'm a college mentor at Two Feathers, and I just graduated with my bachelor's degree in child development and Native American studies and a minor in American Indian education. And I'm really excited to be here today and talk to Mary about the play and other things.
Thank you, Ellen. So a little bit about our speaker, our presenter today is Mary Kathryn Nagle. She is an enrolled citizen of the Cherokee Nation. She's a partner in Pipestem Law, a firm that specializes in representation of tribal governments, tribal enterprises, and Native organizations. Kathryn Nagle, who is also a celebrated playwright of numerous plays such as Manhattan, My Father's Eyes, Silver of a Full Moon, which I was able to see when I was down at Stanford, which was awesome. And then the play that we're going to focus on today, which is more recently released, is Sovereignty, a play that illuminate issues unique to Indian country, all of it, like many other of her plays. So welcome, Mary Kathryn, or Kathryn, sorry.
Mary Kathryn, yes, or yes. MK is fine too. Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here.
Yes, we're excited, and I think that a lot of our team at Two Feathers watches, and then our community. And so, my first question that I have for you is, one of the things that you've said is that by having a Native person stand in front of you and tell their story, you are more likely to understand their point of view. And I think that you've done a magnificent job of telling the story of Native people in contemporary times. And one of the questions that I have for you is, in our audience, for maybe to get to know you a little bit, what are some of the stories that have shaped you in your own life to do the work that you've done? And this, initial set of questions is just giving the audience a little bit more your own background and what shapes and influences some of your work.
Sure. For me, the story of our family was very impactful when I was a child and growing up. And I'm a direct descendant of John Ridge and Major Ridge, who signed Cherokee Nation's Treaty of New Echota. And for folks at Cherokee Nation, there's a lot of strong feelings about that treaty. It is the treaty that sold the land, our ancestral homeland, and where, that is the treaty where we agreed to move west. It's a much more complicated story than that. But growing up, that was, I learned at a very young age that was my family, that's who I was. And also that my fellow Cherokee citizens had very strong feelings about that. And I probably shouldn't tell people I was a Ridge descendant. And so I didn't for a long time. And I also, as a child, was told by my grandmother repeatedly that John Ridge, my great-great-great-grandfather, was the first Native attorney in the history of the United States. And so I think that also was very impactful for me, in addition to the fact and the story that my grandmother always shared, that when the executive branch of the US government and the legislative branch, Congress, were doing everything they could in their power or their authority, or however they stretched that authority, to eradicate us completely, which was Andrew Jackson in Congress. Andrew Jackson Indian Removal Act, which was passed with, that was Congress, right, that passed the act, and President Jackson signed it. It was at that time, when those two branches of the federal government were seeking to exterminate Cherokee Nation, that the United States Supreme Court said we had the inherent right to exist as a nation. And that's the Worcester V Georgia case, which my great-great-great-grandfather worked on. And so did Major Ridge, his father. And so, and as well as Elias Boudinot, my grandfather's cousin, so like my uncle, basically. And so my whole family was working on that case, and it was very impactful to hear about that growing up, and to see how important of a case it remains to be today, although a lot of people too say it's no longer good law, and that there's definitely debates around what that sort of precedent means for the Supreme Court today. And but that was very impactful growing up. And I think, being from Oklahoma, there's just a lot of different tribes, and every tribe there has a story that's very powerful and very important. I think I was also really impacted by learning about Chief Standing Bear's story, again, because I was moving forward and, going to law school and sort of seeking out this life as an attorney, and learning Chief Standing Bear's story, that in 1879, he stood up in a federal court and argued that Indians are persons under the law, at a time when the United States attorney was arguing that Indians are not persons. That was very impactful too, in terms of sort of a role model for how Native people can use the law as a tool for justice, which I think so often we lose in the courts. Those stories were really impactful for me.
Thank you. Good start for us. And, just to lay out our interview, what we were thinking, Ellen and I, was to talk specifically about your recent play, Sovereignty. And so I know Ellen did a fair amount of research and reading it and looking over of the Sovereignty. So as I have, and then maybe getting more into some of the more legal sort of issues around ICWA and other things that you've done in your career. How does that sound?
That sounds great.
Okay, so I'm going to throw it over to Ellen to ask, a question or make a comment about your play Sovereignty.
Sounds good.
Hi.
Hi.
I think that play is so amazing, and I really need to look at the other ones. But I take I'm an NAS major, so I took some federal Indian law classes, and we did learn about Worcester V Georgia and Oliphant, and we kind of just like looked at the cases as they are, and we didn't have any insight to what it could have been. I mean, like, we definitely learned about like the history of genocide and whatnot, but we didn't learn about how it could be like in real time as a person, like making these tough decisions. I think the play like really showed how difficult it could be. And I think like how you talked about how maybe you shouldn't tell people that you're Ridge, this kind of just like shines a light on like how it was back then, like survival versus genocide. I think that was really amazing that you showed that personable kind of thing in the play.
Well, I think what's important is to, so often, and especially as lawyers, we think about the legal issues, which are important, but they're human stories, right? Yeah. And so Worcester v. Georgia is this Supreme Court case that everyone that studies federal Indian law studies, and we maybe have different thoughts on the political significance of it, but it's a story about a family and a nation, and families that were not blood related, but were related sort of in a Cherokee sense, and how the President of the United States decision to refuse to enforce this Supreme Court decision drove a wedge through a family and divided a nation. And that's a very personal story. It's a story of sovereignty, but it's also a very human story. And I think that's what's so important. A lot of Native stories can, they're epic in terms of, this entire tribe, except for 30 people, were wiped out by smallpox, or the Trail of Tears, or, you know, for the Navajo, the Long Walk. I mean, we all have these stories that are so tragic and giant in their proportions and their significance.
Yeah.
But those, you know, it's like, just like you, me, like those were humans and families experiencing that. And I think the power of theater is to show the true human experience of it. And I think too, we're very complicated people. You know, when outside forces come to oppress our nations, not every citizen of that nation reacts the same way, you know, and we have disagreements and about how we should respond to a certain crisis. And I mean, that happens today in all of our tribes, right? Like, we don't all agree on things, but I think it's hard to remember that that was the truth back then too. And, you know, we know how history played out, but they didn't know that. And they didn't know what the outcome would be. And so everyone was just really, most people, I think, were trying to do their very best to save the nation. I think there were probably some bad actors out there, but I think, you know, before we quickly judge our historical Native figures, we also should really look at the human angle of what they were dealing with at the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really appreciate that. I have my professor, Katja Baldy Risling. She talks about how everyone always has this stereotypical image of natives being perfect and it being a utopia and whatnot. And we're all humans. We all make mistakes and things happen. And that's something to remember. Like, they can't expect, even us nowadays, they can't have that kind of stereotype of us as being perfect or being ready as a utopian society and whatnot. But I really appreciated that. And I really liked how on my book, it's like page 65, but it was the scene where the first time, I'm gonna have to go to the bookmark, but when the present meets the past, and that couldn't, I had to read it over like 10 times to try and figure out like how it related. But then once I got to like the end of the book, it made a lot more sense. It was when the very first time. So it's John Ross talking to Sarah Ridge Polson. And I was like, wait, is it supposed to be Jim? And I just thought that was so amazing how you connected that and then connected it in the end as well. And it was just like an amazing end. Like, well, person to person.
Yes. Well, you know, I think that a lot of folks that it was recently published by Northwestern University Press, and I got a lot of emails from different editors saying, oops, there's a typo, you know, it's supposed to be Jim Ross because Sarah Ridge Polson is in the present day and John Ross is in the past. And I said, no, that's not a typo. That's exactly what it's meant to be. And when we did the play at Arena Stage in Washington, D.C. and at the Marin Theater Company out in the Bay Area in California, it's just so powerful to see it on stage when it happens, because in that moment, you've got the actor playing John Ross in this like for the first time in the entire play, there is dissension in Cherokee Nation. And these people who were family and who were working on the same side against Georgia to protect their homeland are now starting to fight each other because they disagree about what to do in response to Andrew Jackson's refusal to enforce the decision. And so it's like this Cherokee on Cherokee anger and aggression that we haven't seen before. And so that's really startling. At the same time that Sarah Ridge Polson's coming in, and so she's the direct descendant of the person that John Ross is fighting with. So here he is having this fight with John Ridge, and his direct descendant comes in and starts talking to him on the other side. And what I'm trying to show is sort of this intergenerational conflict and trauma inside our tribal communities, but also the potential for healing, because by the end of the play, so his modern day character, Jim Ross, is working for the Attorney General of Cherokee Nation, which Sarah Ridge Polson goes to work for. So they're kind of all of a sudden on the same team and end up by the end of the play defending the sovereignty of Cherokee Nation in the Supreme Court. So it's sort of bringing full circle this family that's together. Andrew Jackson and outside United States forces drives a wedge through them. But my goal is that kind of showing it come full circle and the healing that we can have today by sort of saying, hey, these conflicts we're carrying with us from the past were the results of outside oppression. We don't need to hate each other anymore. We can work past these things. And so there is this moment where the actor is playing both characters at the same time, because I'm trying to show that we can't really live in this idea of past is over here and present is over here. It's all, we carry it with us at all times, right? And that's a Cherokee sort of understanding. I think that's true for a lot of tribal cultures, that, you know, time isn't this linear thing where your ancestors are way back there and completely divorced from everything you do today, right? They're the reason we're here, but they're also still guiding us and assisting us and inspiring us, looking out over us. And if we don't really stop and reflect, probably informing the anger we continue to carry with us today and the trauma. So that was kind of my goal with the time warping in the play.
Yeah, I kind of realized that, like, after I got to the end, it's like, whoa, this thing is like 10 times better than when I just finished reading it after reflecting about what it is about, you know? And I think it's also really amazing that, like, you don't need to be in a Native law class to understand what's going on with history. I think that's so amazing. Like our kids can read this and understand the history of, like, why we're stuck the way we are now, you know?
Absolutely. And I think that's one of my goals in what I write, is that I don't want it to be something that you have to be a lawyer to understand, you know, and how lame would that be? I mean, you know, I'm not writing a brief. I'm not trying to convince a judge of something. I'm trying to win in the court of the American public, right? Because the American public is who has allowed this to continue, right? They're not bothered by Oliphant, right? There's no public outcry to say, wait a second, that's so wrong that the Supreme Court in 1978 took away the inherent jurisdiction of tribes, right? There's no public outcry. So, you know, our audience isn't just 9 people wearing a black robe in the Supreme Court. Our audience is all Americans, because at some point they've got to decide, you know what, we're going to stand up for that, just like we're going to stand up for other injustices to communities of color or marginalized socioeconomic classes of Americans, which is all very important, right? But we have to share our story in a way that isn't just in a brief in the Supreme Court, for people, I think, to start to care and listen.
Yeah, and like this kind of story, the way it's being told and how it's so, you know how things kind of just like blow up their trend. I can see this happening with this, but also it fights the dominant narrative that all citizens have learned about. And I think that's really important, not just for Native people, but for people studying law, people being a cop, lots of things. They just don't learn it. And this is one of the things that can show up on their life and completely change their perspective.
I think so. I hope so. That is my goal.
And I also really appreciate how you like talking about the past and the present again, but also bringing up VAWA and how important it is, that it needs to be there, because that's all we got, you know, that's all we got to protect our Native women and children and families. Yeah.
So, you know, thanks, Ellen, for those wonderful questions. And one of the things that, you know, we're hoping to get out of this speaker series is like understanding the individuals that we interview, like yourself, like what are the sort of approaches and the ideas, the routines, the sort of tactics that guide your work, so that we can understand it in our own community, and not just as Native Indigenous people, but those that are working within Native communities. And I think one of the things that I take from your plays and your work is, and you mentioned it, is the power of storytelling. And I know one of the things that you talk about is how being a great lawyer and being a great person that writes plays, there's similarities, many similarities, and specifically with around storytelling. And so my question is like, what is it? Where did that gift come from, and what is the sort of process or the sort of routines that you go about to tell these very important stories? And so, how have you become as we see it, a great storyteller? Like, what is it about you and your process of telling a good story, both legally and in your plays?
Gosh, I don't know. I just, I think there's a storyteller in all of us. I don't think there's anyone who's not a storyteller, but I think some people are more inclined to it than others. And from the time I was at a very young age, I loved making up stories. And I had two younger sisters, and I would force them to act them out with me. So I would assign them roles and kind of tell them, okay, you do this, and then you do it, and then we did perform for our neighbors and everyone on the street. And that was one of my favorite things to do, was to tell my sisters what to do and tell a story. And I loved writing too. I used to write little books when I was in like first grade, and they were really ridiculous. Like one story was about Dolly the dollar bill, and it was all about the different adventures she had, the different pockets she ended up in. So I've always loved stories. I've loved hearing them. I've loved reading them. I've loved writing them since I could read and write and hear and listen and talk. And maybe that's just sort of who I am and what I'm made up of. But I think that, if anyone is passionate about sharing stories or loves telling stories, loves hearing stories, I think, don't worry about what the end goal is. It's like, you just have to keep at it. I think it can be very frustrating depending on whether if you're like, oh, I'm going to write for TV, or I'm going to write for theater, or I'm going to write a children's book and get it published. That's a great goal to have, but just don't get stuck on it, because there's so much rejection for people who are writers, or think about it, professional storytellers, whether you're an actor, or there's a lot of artists who share stories, and it's a very tough practice. Today, I mean, I think traditionally we had a lot more roles and spaces in our communities and cultures for storytellers, but capitalism isn't necessarily the best framework for that. So you just really have to not focus so much on, just sort of making it, and just tell stories that keep you up at night, that you can't sleep because you've got to share it, or just really move you, and that you have to just get out of you, and just get it out and write it, share it, whatever speaks to you. Maybe it's dance, maybe it's traditional music, maybe it's contemporary music, whatever it is, and just go for it and share it, and just never lose sight of why you love sharing it. That's hard, especially once you get to be a professional and you have contracts and work and jobs you have to do, and deadlines, and it's like, why am I writing this? Why am I doing this? You can lose sight of that pretty quickly. So it's important to not get disconnected from the why you began in the first place. But I just think anyone who has that passion or that interest should go for it, and never question, like, will I make it, right? Because that's not even what it's about at the end of the day.
Thank you. Yeah, we had Dr. Phil Deloria on here earlier in initials. So he was like our fourth speaker, I think. But one of the things that I asked him was, because I read we talked about his most recent book, and it was about his aunt, right? His great aunt. And so I asked about how it is for him personally, getting so in depth in researching and understanding your family history. And I think with your place, the sovereignty, it's your great grandpa, three greats, maybe.
Yeah. John Ridge is my great grandfather, and Major Ridge is my great grandfather.
And so and part of what we do at Two Feathers is counseling and therapy, and a big part of that is understanding yourself to promote wellness, right? Or understanding your tribal history. And so my question for you is, as a follow-up, is like, how has it been for you to understand your history at this level and in this detail in your own personal life?
You know, it can be very difficult to share your own personal life in such a public way. I had a lot of hesitations about doing that. And I wasn't really, people at Cherokee Nation didn't know I was a Ridge descendant. And I had friends who I had heard publicly say that the signers of the treaty that my grandfather signed were traitors and deserved to be killed for signing the treaty. So when you have friends that you have a nice relationship with and you hear them say that, you don't want to say, hey, I'm directly descended from the people who you say should have been murdered and were murdered, but like they're basically saying they deserve to be killed. And that's painful. There's a lot of trauma in my family. My grandmother's grandmother was 4 years old when she watched her dad be stabbed to death 40 times on the front porch of their house. So it's not like, you don't really just like, oh, wake up one morning and you're like, that's okay. That was, people were just upset, right? It's a very painful, bitter thing that exists in our family, and having to sort of air that laundry publicly and people have said some hateful things to me. I'm still surprised at, I would think, well, gosh, I don't agree with everything Principal Chief John Ross did, but I'm not going to go up to his direct descendants and tell them that he's, a beep that deserves to be killed, So, but again, you can't underestimate the impact of trauma and intergenerational trauma. And we had a lot of loss and a lot of hurt. And that's where it all comes from. So but you putting yourself out there and your family story out there is very challenging and very raw. I will say writing it was very difficult. Like there were days where I think it felt very healing and I was releasing something. And then there are days where, especially when theater is very collaborative. So you're inviting other people to come into your process, and people are very sort of, the American theater has this attitude of a new play is open to be dissected. So everyone's like, oh, I don't know. Like, is it really believable that this or that would happen? And you're like, yes, because it did happen. And I don't want to have to sit here and debate, with this person about whether or not Andrew Jackson was really racist. Like, why am I having this debate, right? And so, but when it's your personal story of your family and your nation, it's very hard to approach those conversations without having a lot of anger. And especially you throw in domestic violence, right? And a lot of Native women, we've survived different things. This story, that the contemporary side is not autobiographical for me, but I will say I didn't write it from a complete place of ignorance. Like there have been experiences in my personal life, but also a lot of work that I do as an attorney to get protective orders for Native women, to fight these issues in the courts. I've seen how non-Native, non-tribal citizen men react to, Native women standing up and saying, I will not take this abuse anymore, or you did this thing to me, and that was rape, or this was that. And sort of the sense of entitlement of, well, you can't get me for that. I can't be called into tribal court. Tribal courts aren't real. I'm an American citizen, and I can't tell you how many times I had very frustrating conversations with people who were trying to do their best and were involved in my play and didn't think it was believable that a white guy would say today some of the things that Ben's character says. So, and I'm like, wow, because I've heard them, I don't know. It's that's very hard. It's hard because you have to be the messenger for your play. You can't attack everyone for being idiots when you're sharing something. You have to be very understanding and kind and gracious. There's so much ignorance especially about Native stories. And so if you're a Native writer and you're going to share any part of your story, you're going to have audience people who say really dumb things to you, and it's going to hurt. And it's an unfair burden. It's not fair to Native people who want to share their stories that they have to, because like white people don't have that burden, right? Like Donald Trump could write a book about his world life and his experience and no one's going to say, gosh, I didn't realize that, XYZ about your life. Like, I didn't know your people lived in New York, like, right. No one's going to say that to him, because the fact that white people live in New York is front and center on TV every day and in all over the media. And, but Native people aren't. We've been erased. And so I think it's very hard for Native people to put their personal stories out there because they're going into a society that has erased them. And so there's sort of even from people who want to be allies, an ignorant backlash response always that can be very difficult when it's your personal story.
That makes sense. My dissertation I did was on digital storytelling, and as a way to, and it was personal stories. And so, as the researcher, I did my own story and put my struggle with addiction out there, and so I really resonate with what you had to say, because it took me a while to get that story out, and I had to do work on myself to be able to get to the place where I felt like it was authentic and real.
Yeah. Yes.
And, I think, about this time of the interview, maybe we'll switch a little over to, because we have many interests in your work. And we do a lot of work around domestic violence and sexual assault prevention and work within the tribal communities. That was actually, what originally Two Feathers kind of was founded on, and we've switched a little bit over the last couple of years. We're still doing a big part of that work, but we're also doing a lot of youth prevention and intervention work. So I know, Ellen, I'm going to throw it over to you, because I know you, before our talk, you said you had some other issues that you wanted to ask Mary Kathryn, and so maybe the time is now.
So I've been interested in federal Indian law and whatnot, and this is kind of like a really off-topic question, but have you been, well, you probably have, but the Brackeen case, was, one of the oral arguments was that the Congress doesn't have the right to have the power over American Indians because of the Commerce Clause. Does that come up a lot in your work, or is that just?
Well, it's a new argument. I will say that the Commerce Clause was historically used as a justification to control us. So when tribes were filing suits in the late 1800s and the early 1900s to say, whoa, wait a second, we signed a treaty for this land. And then, and the president signed it, and the Constitution says that once the president signs a treaty ratified by the Senate, it's the supreme law of the land. So we have this reservation, supreme law of the land under the Constitution, we're good. Congress comes along and disestablishes it and allocts it against our will, without our permission, and says, hey, you don't have a reservation anymore. It's all owned by these white people. And so there were lawsuits like that brought by tribes where they said, Congress didn't have the constitutional authority to do that, right? We signed a treaty for that, and no one asked us, so you can't take it away from us. And the Supreme Court said, oh, no. Congress has this plenary power over Indian affairs. It's an unquestionable, exclusive power. And part of the justification, and this is a little bit of a doctrinal debate, but a major thrust of it has been the Commerce Clause. That hasn't been the exclusive place that the Supreme Court has looked to justify this congressional plenary power doctrine, but that has been one of the bases. And so it was used against us when Congress was doing bad things to us. And when we said that's illegitimate, the Supreme Court said, well, this is the way it is. And now we've got, white fundamental religious organizations that are trying to run a multi-billion-dollar adoption industry and take Indian babies and give them to white families because they see the money and the value in it, are trying to make the Indian Child Welfare Act an unconstitutional act. And one of their arguments is to say, well, Congress doesn't have the constitutional authority to do this. It's based on the Commerce Clause, and this has nothing to do with commerce. Well, that's never been an issue before. Before, when the Commerce Clause, and again, the Indian Commerce Clause is different than the Commerce Clause that applies to Congress's dealings with the states. It's totally separate. But if you look at the Constitution, there's a clause that says, basically, Congress has the authority to deal with commerce with the Indian tribes, which made sense at the time of the Constitution, right? A lot of trade going on with tribal nations. And you kind of needed a centralized authority to be the authority over that, as opposed to having every state make up their own rules about how they would trade with tribal nations. The Supreme Court, when it was used to justify Congress's taking away from us, never said, oh, but wait, that, disestablishing a reservation has nothing to do with commerce, right? Allotting the reservation isn't commerce. That's not trading, it's just taking. That was never an issue before. Now, all of a sudden, these litigants are out there trying to destroy the Indian Child Welfare Act, and they're wanting to turn all of the Supreme Court's Indian commerce jurisprudence on its head. And, they probably have a couple sympathetic people in the Supreme Court, like Justice Thomas. So, it's hard to say what will happen. It is very concerning to see them make what I think are ridiculous arguments.
Yeah. I think it's just wild that they're going after it. Like, did they just learn about it, or have they always known about it? Or like you're saying, like $1 billion corporation, like, is it all just the money that's finally attacking it?
I do think that a lot of it has to do with the money. The Koch brothers are funding a lot of this. Now people might say, well, why do the Koch brothers care about adoption? But I think a lot of energy, oil, gas kind of industries care about disestablishing tribal sovereignty, because look at like the, Standing Rock Dakota Access case, right?
Yeah.
If a tribe can truly be sovereign over its territory, and if, consultation with the tribal nation means something, you have to actually consult with that sovereign, which the federal government didn't really do in the case of Standing Rock and the Dakota Access Pipeline. Then tribes are going to have the authority to say, no, I don't consent to that. I'm a sovereign, I'm saying no. And I think for a lot of oil and gas industries, that's very scary. They don't want tribes to be able to say no, right? They want tribes to not have a say. And so I think the more they can chip away at tribal sovereignty and the inherent authority of tribal nations, the better their industries will do, is in their mind. I think that's just ludicrous. There's also plenty of tribes that would love to have oil and gas companies come drill on their lands and let them, right? So it's not like it's about the right of a sovereign to give that consent or to say no. It's not like our tribes are basically all set in one direction or the other against industry or for industries. But again, I think they've made their mind up that they need to attack tribal sovereignty and tribal authority.
Yeah. Is that the same case in like the Dollar General case that was brought up in the play?
I think that was not like, I don't know that was directly funded by the Koch brothers. I've never heard that or received any information on that. I think that was a very short-sighted decision by the executives at the Dollar General Corporation that they did not, they were just, I think a lot of people also have disdain for tribal courts, I think based on prejudice and racial ignorance, and just this idea that, tribal courts are somehow inferior to courts run and administered by states and the federal government. I think it's just a prejudicial notion that is absolutely undermined by the incredible quality of the tribal court judges we have. But unfortunately, that prejudice, I think, inspires a lot of people to challenge tribal court jurisdiction. And also, it's a money thing, right? I mean, they don't want to have to pay this family for the fact that their employee repeatedly sexually assaulted a young tribal citizen on tribal lands in a store, that they were leasing from the tribe. And this was a way to they thought they could save themselves money by hiring lawyers to fight this.
But then they got down a whole lot more than what would have happened. So yeah. I think that's just, yeah. So for VAWA, do you work with anything that, or what is your work predominantly like right now when you work with law?
Well, we do a lot of work for tribal governments. I do a lot of work on the Violence Against Women Act. So I represent a lot of victims and survivors, getting protective orders in tribal courts, enforcing those protective orders in state courts, all kinds of work like that. We do work to advocate for Congress to reauthorize the Violence Against Women Act with a tribal jurisdiction provision in it that will further address the categories of jurisdiction that were eliminated by Oliphant and not restored in VAWA 2013. We do a lot of work on the Indian Child Welfare Act. We, have all kinds of lawsuits where we represent different tribal governments in federal court. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, it definitely does.
And I had a follow up on that, speaking
Mhm.
to like the understanding the skills and the routines and the practices of people that we interview. You use the word advocacy. What does it mean legally, and just, in your place too, to advocate for what is it? How do we become better advocates for these issues? Do you see, maybe in our own community-based mental health clinic, social service clinic here, or if we have a student, like in your experience, how can we become better advocates for these issues, such as VAWA?
That's a great question. I would say talk to your tribal government. Make sure they understand how important this issue is, and that when they go to DC and they meet with members of Congress, this should be one of the top issues they talk about. If your tribe has a lobbyist, this should be one of the issues that they have to work on and report on all the time. I think sometimes it gets pushed under the rug as because it's not gaming, it's not going to bring the tribe revenue. It's not one of the hot issues that a lot of people tend to focus on, but it's life or death for our citizens, right? And so it's very important. And I think sort of reminding your tribal government this is an issue you vote on, and that you expect them to address this issue when they go to Washington D.C. and speak with Congress is always important. um, and then I think just tell your story, whether it's writing a letter to the editor about if you have DV in your family or your own personal life, if you want to share that story. Personal stories are really impactful for policymakers and public opinion. I think, you know, on days like May 5th, when national organizations like the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center and Sovereign Bodies Institute and Urban Indian Health Institute, I think three of the top organizations working on MMIW issues, are doing a National Day of Awareness. Like, get on social media, post photos. Like, there's really no right or wrong way to do it. I think we all have different talents. Like, I'm not really great at social media, so I mean, I tweet every now and then, but that's probably not my most effective tool. Like, my most effective tool might be the plays that I'm writing, but for some people it might be they write really great tweets and they can tweet 8 times a day, and that's great, and get it out there. Or maybe it is that you have an auntie on tribal council and you go to her and you say, Auntie, this is really important and here's why. And you talk her into making it one of the top issues the tribal council cares about, and tells their lobbyist, you got to talk, so it could be any number of those things. And I think, especially the work that you two do with youth, I think most importantly, our youth just need to hear that they matter, that they're important. The generations of trauma that our communities have experienced and survived has created family situations for some of our youth where they don't get that message. And so it's up to all of us in our own tribal community to make sure the youth around us hear that and have role models that, because you never know who's going to be the next, famous Native actress to go star on Broadway and share the story of sovereignty with the world, right? That play, right? Like, you don't know what these young folks are going to do with their lives. They could be an amazing lawyer that might win a case for a tribal nation in the Supreme Court that undoes Oliphant, right? So all of our youth are just also, you don't have to be writing letters to Congress or calling your member of Congress to really work on these issues. Like, inspiring youth to be healthy and to love themselves and to see that they're valued, and then they go off and do amazing things with their life, I think is just as important as walking the halls of Congress and knocking on their door and demanding the reauthorization of VAWA. Oh, I
You're
think
muted, Virgil.
I knew that was going to happen one time, going back and forth with the mute. That was, well said. And, that was kind of a question. What you said kind of answered a question from our audience. And that question was, what advice would you give youth who want to use art to create change in their own community? And so, these art-based programs such as theater and really giving them a voice, right?
Mm-hmm. I say do it. There have been so many inspiring examples of young Native artists who have taken on, maybe it's, making a different dress or skirt every day and wearing it to school to say, this is in honor of a specific Native woman or child or girl that has gone missing or has been murdered, to raise awareness around MMIW. Maybe it's that you're a really talented writer of graphic novels, and maybe you write an amazing series of graphic novels that you can share, that tells the story of a Native woman warrior who survives domestic violence or a sexual assault, or anything like that. We all have so many different talents, and I think for youth, I think dive into what your talents are, invest your time and your energy in them, and find an adult who supports you. There are plenty of horrible adults that don't support you, and don't worry about that. We all have to get past that in our lives. There's always going to be someone who tells you you can't follow your dreams, and that's probably because they made the bad decision when they were younger not to, and now they're resentful that you might be doing that. So find those adults, because they're there in your community that do believe in you and want to support your vision. Find them. Sometimes we have to search a little bit, and that's unfortunate. We shouldn't have to, but just find those adults in your community, whether it's a teacher, someone in a program like Two Feathers. Find that person. Maybe it's an auntie, maybe it's a grandma, maybe it's a neighbor, maybe it's a friend's parent. Maybe it is your parent, and I hope it is, but it isn't always, right? And that's the unfortunate reality for some of us. And so just find that person who believes in you, and then just don't listen to people when they don't believe in you, because believe me, if I had listened, there were plenty of people who told me it was ridiculous that I thought I could write plays, and like, what was I going to do with that? What a waste of time, what a joke. And 20 years later, look what I'm doing. So, we can't listen to people who don't believe in dreams.
Thank you. So I see we have a little bit of time left. And so I wanted to see if Ellen had any final questions, or, I could throw one out there too, but I want to see if you have any, Ellen.
I don't have a question. I got to sit on the play and how I'm going to try and engage with my youth, because I mentor 6 youth or so, and they're all just like, they're incredible and they're all amazing. And this is really going to help me figure out ways to boost like their creativity and, just support them as much as I can. So thank you.
Great. Well, I hope they write their own plays.
That would be amazing.
And Mary, Kathryn, you have to know that Ellen, she recently graduated from Humboldt State, and she was awarded one of the student of the year, one of the students of the year at the local university recently.
That's amazing. Congratulations.
Thank you. I think it's pretty crazy, but it kind of just makes me want to do like more than what I thought I was going to do,
Absolutely.
Like, yeah.
Absolutely. Wow. That's awesome. That's really awesome.
Yeah, it's quite an accomplishment, and she's a local native too, part of the Hoopa Valley tribe. So it's, such a good representation and getting past that erasure of our people, and representing us in a good way.
Mm-hmm. That's really wonderful. Well, I hope you'll stay in touch and let me know what you're doing and what you're up to next after graduation. And just very excited to hear what happens with the youth that you're working with, because engaging with them and sort of doing theater, but then hopefully in sharing their own stories, I think can be very, very healing and very inspiring.
Mm-hmm. I'm doing a master's in social work at HSU, but I was also kind of like thinking about law school too, but we'll see about that. So
we'll keep thinking about it. Virgil has my email, so if you ever want to ask me a question about law school, don't hesitate to reach out.
Thank you.
And so as a sort of summary of our time together, I know that one of the things you said about your play is that you said that I hope that folks who come see this play, Sovereignty, and some of your other plays will take away the knowledge that their knowledge is incomplete. And that the reason it is incomplete, it is not an accident, right? That it was purposeful, it was by design. And so you're, I think, have done a great job uncovering these stories that aren't told and that should be told. And so with that, as the sort of final statement, my ask is for you to just talk a little bit more about the importance of sovereignty, the importance of issues such as BAWA, issues such as ICWA, and just as a way to summarize and to inspire or educate or just uh, talk about the importance of those issues for our community and the audience that's tuning in to hear.
Yeah, well, they're very important issues because they deal with the right of our nation to continue to exist, really. Without sovereignty, we have no nation, right? And our nation is what got us through all of the tragedies that we've survived to be here today. Our nations have distinct languages that tell us who we are and how to live our life. That if we lose all of that, right, we lose a whole way of understanding life, of healing ourselves, of dealing with life's tragedies, of persevering. And that's something we don't have in English, right? We have laws, we have traditions, we have customs, all of our nations do, that make us stronger, and give us something that we can't find in the larger American culture or society. So we do need to protect those elements of our sovereignty and our culture. And that's what sovereignty does protect. But when it becomes discarded or dismantled by Congress or the Supreme Court, or Dollar General Corporation that wants to attack it in the Supreme Court, we stand to lose a lot. We stand, sometimes it is financial, right? If it's a gaming case, and that's no joke, right? Like, gaming revenues support language preservation, youth programs, domestic violence shelters, hospitals. Like, I mean, that's really, economic issues are very important. But also, if you look at the sovereignty issues, like, it's about whether or not our tribal law enforcement can go arrest a non-Indian man who's beating a Native woman on tribal lands. It's about whether or not, when the state tries to take a tribal citizen from a Native family on tribal lands, can the tribe say, actually, we have the most interest in that child's health and welfare. We will adjudicate whether or not the parent's rights should be terminated, and if so, what family within that child's family here at our tribal nation should have that child and raise that child, right? Just like the United States says, hey, we have an interest in what happens to our children, and that's a better interest than France or Canada, right? That's exactly what a tribal nation is saying. But our rights are constantly under attack, and they have been since 1492, and they continue to be. And so we have to keep fighting, because we have every right to self-govern and to protect the health, life, and welfare of our citizens, as the state of California does, as the state of Oklahoma does. We have the same right, if not more, but we have to fight for it, right? It isn't being recognized fully right now.
Thank you. Well said, and a great finish to our wonderful conversation.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, it's thank you for spending the time. I know you're I can only imagine how busy you are. So
well, there's a lot of brief writing going on, but yes, so thank you so much, and please do stay in touch. I want to hear how it goes with the youth.
Yes, we definitely will. And thank you, Ellen, also for tuning in. And those of you that are tuning in online, thanks for all the comments. And we try to get some questions. And we will be back at it tomorrow and Friday at noon. So tune in.
Thank you.
All right. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.